and welcome to episode 2, part 3 of Philosophy of X here on the Aspect Network. I'm your host, Alex Batts, and I'll be your guide as we take a journey to examine the world of the X-Men through philosophy. So, we have reached the end of our first multi-part episode. Looking back, it's honestly kind of ridiculous that I thought I'd be able to cover all of the topics that I had planned for Magneto in just one episode, but it's been a super fun learning experience along the way. We've now reached the third and final part of this series, even though I'm sure I'll probably come back to Magneto at some point, but that said, since this is part 3 in a series, I will be skipping the normal character breakdown segment of the show, wherein I give the pertinent background information on whatever character I'm discussing. If you are somehow listening to this and you haven't checked out part 1 or part 2 of Magneto and the Ethics of Mutant Liberation, definitely be sure to give those a listen and then come back here for more of the discussion. In that first part, I lay out the need-to-know details about Magneto as a character, and also dive into the ethics of just war theory and how those tensions are explored in a character like Magneto. In the second part, I dive into the ethical pluralism that a character like Magneto exemplifies. For this third and final part, I'll be diving into the ideals of collective responsibility that Magneto encourages discussions of. I noted in the previous episode that while I had initially intended to also cover the paradox of power that Magneto represents, I've elected to push that topic back to a separate episode. While it's an important facet of Magneto as a character, it's also something that can be applied to Mutantum as a whole. When I do take this route, I'll likely make an entire episode out of it, and in that episode, I'll still carve out space to cover its applicability to Magneto specifically. Before I get into all those details, as I did with previous Magneto episodes, I want to give a couple of quick notes that I think are important, as well as some content warnings. So, content warning first. I'll be covering anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, genocide, bigotry, murder, war, and related topics. These are heavy subjects, and I want to do my best to approach them with the appropriate level of sensitivity. So, with that said, let's dive right into the philosophy for this episode with the ethics of collective responsibility or collective punishment. Before we get into the weeds here, I'd like to again drop some sources in case you'd like to do some further reading on your own. Some titles to check out include The Ethics of War and Peace, an Introduction by Helen Froh, Punishment and Ethics, New Perspectives, edited by Jesper Ryberg and Julian Saveluscu, Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong by J.L. Mackie, and The Morality of War, edited by David Roden and Henry Sue. For this episode, I will, as usual, be pulling a lot from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on collective responsibility, which I will have linked down below. So, with all of that cited, let's dive into our discussion. Collective responsibility is an idea that stems both from personal responsibility and shared responsibility. It refers in most contexts to both the causal responsibility of moral agents for harm in the world and the blameworthiness that we ascribe to them for having caused such harm. It is almost always a notion of moral rather than purely causal responsibility. However, unlike its two purely individualistic counterparts, it doesn't associate either causal responsibility or blameworthiness with individuals or locate the source of moral responsibility in the free will of individual agents. Instead, it associates both with groups and attempts to locate the source of moral responsibility in the collective actions taken by these groups, which are understood as collectives. First off, it's important to establish some of these terms. A moral agent is a person who acts in the world. You and I are moral agents, for example. We make decisions that have an impact in the world around us. The next important term to understand is causal responsibility, or relationships. A causal relationship is something where you can see a direct line between cause and effect. Essentially, if I push a glass off a table and it shatters, there is a causal relationship between me pushing the glass off of the table and it shattering. We use causal relationships as a part of the equation when ascribing moral blame or responsibility, which leads us to the next term or concept to understand: moral blameworthiness and or responsibility. Moral responsibility is, roughly, our attempt at holding moral agents accountable for their actions, specifically the harms their actions have caused in the world around them. We aren't too concerned with holding people morally accountable for the good that they've caused, more so just the bad or potential bad. This episode isn't about individual moral responsibility, but we do need a basic understanding of it to move forward into the conversation of collective responsibility. Essentially, moral responsibility is found or attempted to be found through examining both the actions and intentions of a moral agent. We look at the causal relationship of their actions and the intentions of those actions, and then ascribe moral responsibility accordingly. For example, if X caused Y thing to happen, we look at both the Y caused by X, but we'll also factor in if the Y result was the intention of X. Assigning individual moral responsibility and accountability can be tricky enough, and as you might imagine, it becomes exponentially more complicated when applying it to collectives. There's a big debate in general about whether or not collective responsibility can even exist. There are three main concerns placed in the center of the debate. The first has to do with whether groups have to meet the same stringent conditions of moral responsibility that individuals do. The second has to do with the advantages and disadvantages of holding particular kinds of groups, for example, nation states, races, and ethnic groups, morally responsible. The third has to do with what moral implications follow for group members from the moral responsibility of their group for harm. Do individuals become responsible for the harm their collective has caused? And if so, how is the blame to be distributed? These three concerns are mostly attributed with what is known as the backward-looking notion of collective responsibility, in effect, assigning blame after the fact. During the past several years, however, there has been a growing interest in what has become known as forward-looking collective responsibility. Unlike its backward-looking counterpart, it does not focus on whether a particular collective agent caused harm in the sense relevant to moral blameworthiness. Instead, it focuses on what, if anything, the agent can be expected to do with respect to remedying the harm and preventing its recurrence. Both the traditional backwards-looking notion of collective responsibility and the forward-looking notion of collective responsibility are controversial. There are three main controversies surrounding the traditional notion of collective responsibility. The first of these controversies is concerned with whether or not collective responsibility makes sense as a form of moral responsibility. The primary focus here has to do with both the moral agency of groups in general and the possibility of group intentions. Proponents of this controversy ask how we can understand the notion of collective responsibility as a matter of moral and not just causal responsibility. Is it possible for groups to be distinct from their members? Is it possible for such groups to cause harm in the sense required by moral responsibility? Is it possible for groups to act as collectives, to have an intent? Is it possible for groups to be morally blameworthy for harm, to be guilty as moral agents? The second controversy is less about the moral responsibility of groups as collectives and more about the moral responsibility of individual moral agents within these collectives. How can we distribute collective responsibility in general? Is it appropriate to hold individual group members morally responsible for harm that the other group members have caused, that the group itself has caused, that the group as a whole failed to prevent? And if so, under what conditions with respect to particular kinds of groups? Random collectives, interest-based groups, corporate entities? The third controversy is primarily concerned with the practicality of ascribing collective responsibility and how it might impede our ability to sustain the values of individualism, freedom, and justice. In some cases, the concern is with the ascriptions of collective responsibility in particular contexts such as war tribunals, reparations for slavery, terrorism, and rape, and whether such ascriptions are productive and/or fair to those being blamed. What would happen if we were to replace individual responsibility with collective responsibility? Would we be letting individuals off the hook and in the process eroding the practice of personal responsibility in general? The controversies surrounding forward-looking collective responsibility have to do with the role of agent causation in ascribing responsibility in the attempt to remedy harm in the world. Does the responsibility for remedying harm caused come down to who caused the harm? If not, what other criteria are there? Should we turn to those who are most capable of preventing the harm and the community of which they are a part? What happens in cases when there is no collective entity capable of taking remedial action? Do we have a moral obligation to bring such a collective entity about? And if so, on what basis and how? As you can already tell, there's a lot of tough questions here, and it only gets more difficult the more we dive in. Two claims about collective responsibility become crucial. The first is the argument that groups, unlike individuals, cannot form intentions and therefore cannot be understood to act or to cause harm as being groups. The second is that groups, as distinct from individuals, cannot be understood as morally blameworthy in the sense required by moral responsibility. There is one camp that firmly and vehemently argues that it is illogical to attempt to ascribe collective responsibility in the same way that we do for individuals. H.D. Lewis says, quote, "Value belongs to the individual, and it is the individual who is the sole bearer of moral responsibility. No one is morally guilty except in relation to some conduct which he himself considered to be wrong. Collective responsibility is barbarous." End quote. Stephen Sverdlik agrees with Lewis's sentiment, but doesn't go so far as to call collective responsibility barbarous. Sverdlik writes, quote, "It would be unfair, whether we are considering a result produced by more than one person's actions or by a single person, to blame a person for a result that he or she did not intend to produce." End quote. Both of these standpoints hinge on two assumptions that are key, both concerning the importance of intention. The first is that actions, whether individual or collective, necessarily begin with intentions. The second is that moral blameworthiness has its source and requires the existence of bad intentions, or at the very least moral faultiness, on the part of those being held responsible. This is to say that in order to ascribe moral responsibility to an individual or group, there has to be an intent behind those actions. And as we've already discussed, many take issue with the idea that collectives can truly have intentions beyond the individuals that make up that collective. This concentration on intention and the necessity for bad intention or moral faultiness posits that it is impossible for collectives to have intentions beyond the individual intentions of its members, and that it is similarly impossible for a collective to have moral character. It posits that groups cannot have minds of their own, and therefore cannot be ascribed moral responsibility. R.S. Downey sums it up well here, quote, "Collectives do not have moral faults since they don't make moral choices, and hence they cannot properly be ascribed moral responsibility. For there to be moral responsibility, there must be blameworthiness involving a morally faulty decision, and this can only occur at the individual level." End quote. Defenders of collective responsibility utilize a variety of philosophical strategies to debunk the aforementioned claims and to justify the possibility of collective responsibility. One strategy has been to point out that in practice we blame groups all the time. This is further broken down by pointing to examples of blame that we ascribe that are impossible to break down to an individual level, because the collective itself is not determined by the individuals but exists beyond them, such as with nation-states and sports clubs. Peter French highlights this well, quote, "There is a class of predicates that just cannot be true of individuals, that can only be true of collectives. Examples of such predicates abound and include disbanded, lost the football game, elected a president, and passed an amendment. Methodological individualism would be at a loss in this context." End quote. In other words, these things can only apply to collectives. It wouldn't make any sense to say any of the just mentioned phrases about an individual. So there's a lot of back and forth that begins to happen between the competing camps about whether collective responsibility can exist. One of the more compelling arguments in favor of its existence comes from List and Petit, which argues that groups can meet the requirements of moral agency by virtue of the fact that they have representational states, motivational states, and a capacity to process them and act on their basis. Peter French also outlines three features that would render a group viable for the burden of collective responsibility. The first is a series of organizational mechanisms through which courses of concentrated action can be chosen. The second is a set of enforced standards of conduct for individuals within the group, and the third is a configuration of defined roles by which individuals can exercise certain powers. These three features, according to French, signal the existence of purposeful and controlled actions which render the groups collectively responsible for harm. I've done an exhaustive amount of research going into the back and forth that makes up the arguments for and against collective responsibility and how it might or might not exist and what its many different forms might entail, and I can feel myself slipping too into the weeds and losing sight of the focus that I want to keep on how exactly this relates back to Magneto. So before we get further into the ins and outs of the arguments, I'm going to hit some quick points summing things up, and then we'll transition into whether the Master of Magnetism and his actions come into play. Can collective responsibility exist? Short answer, maybe, but probably yes. Long answer, yes, but maybe only in some cases. I think it's fair to say that more organized structures can be proven to meet at least some criteria for moral responsibility in the same way that we ascribe it at the individual level. At the very least, the same problems that apply to placing moral responsibility on a collective level also occur at the individual level, so it follows that the former shouldn't immediately be dismissed. It gets muddier the more loose a group or collective becomes. Mobs and random collections of people make things infinitely more fuzzy when it comes to holding a collective responsible. Is inaction as morally accountable as action? If you have the opportunity to prevent some harm but don't, is that as bad as inflicting the harm personally? If we do believe in collective responsibility, how do we go about discerning it, and what are the paths forward? These are the biggest questions that will all link back to Magneto. So we'll take a quick break and then dive back in with how it all ties back to the Master of Magnetism.
Hi, my name is Negan.
And I'm Bree. Enjoying this show on the Aspect Network?
Then check out Viltrumikes, an Invincible podcast.
Each week, we go back and discuss your favorite episodes of the series and review new episodes as they release right on Amazon Prime.
Join us as we travel space, time, and the multiverse with Mark Grayson and discuss one of the most exciting superhero series on TV on Viltrumikes, here on the Aspect Network.
And now, back to the show.
So the biggest elephant in the room is that Magneto historically does absolutely believe in collective responsibility and punishment. His actions repeatedly put the lives of debatably innocent humans at danger for the actions caused by a select group of humans. Is he justified in doing this? Magneto would certainly argue yes. As I discussed in the first part of this series, Magneto has often taken an ends justify the means approach to his philosophy. If it takes the destruction of property, violence, and sometimes the death of innocent humans to prevent further harm inflicted upon mutants, then so be it. Let's talk about whether or not there are any innocent humans in this debate. Magneto, historically, would argue that there aren't. This would fall into arguments about inaction being as morally responsible as action itself. Magneto could argue that humans, knowing the pain and horrors inflicted upon mutants, yet choosing to do nothing to stop it, are just as morally accountable for the harms caused as those inflicting the harm. It's easy to see how this can be a justified argument. Those who sit by idly and let atrocities be committed when they could do something to stop it do often feel levels of guilt about their lack of action. Our intuition tells us that there's something to this. Whether or not that makes Magneto justified in punishing them with violence and potentially death is still debatable though, and it's something that he himself struggles with. Just recently, he's taking more of a turn into doing what he can to save as many humans as he can, despite their possible inaction on behalf of mutants. One of the other key points of discussion when it comes to collective punishment circles back to something that we again talked about in part 1 of this series, the proportionality principle in ethics. The idea that the severity of punishment should be proportionate to the offense committed. In Magneto's case, he's survived multiple genocides. Is he not then justified in whatever violence he unleashes in return? He's proportionally probably still in the positive when it comes to lives taken stacked against the mutant lives taken. Proportionally, it's not difficult to see that Magneto is acting in, at the very least, a proportional response to the violence inflicted upon mutants. It'd be near impossible for Magneto alone to inflict the level of oppression onto humanity that they have inflicted onto mutantum. But does this mean that Magneto is morally correct to do so? This again is something the character struggles with. He doesn't want to be a conduit for a cycle of violence. He simply sees no other way against those attempting successfully to oppress mutantum. The cycle of violence is another angle that has to be taken into account here. Violence begetting violence will simply always lead to more violence. Logically, humans could then use Magneto's own rationale and arguments of proportionality to retaliate with violence against him and, by extension, innocent mutants. Logic is not biased. So, do Magneto's actions in embracing collective punishment just continue to perpetuate the same violence he's attempting to stop? It would appear so, but what are the other options? The ethical perspectives of consequentialism and deontology can also come into play here. Consequentialists would likely argue with the just stated stance that violence will only beget more violence, and that the harms caused by collective punishment will outweigh any potential benefits that it could bring. Deontologists would simply argue that harming innocent individuals is a violation of fundamental moral principles, such as murder is wrong, regardless of context or intended outcomes. So where do we go from here? Short answer, there are no easy answers here. That's philosophy, baby. It's a bunch of questions that often lead to harder, more complex questions and no answers. It's tough, but the reason I love it is that it encourages you to think on it and try to develop your own stances on the tough ideas and concepts that we face. These questions, which are already difficult enough in the real world, are made even more complicated when placed into the realm of superheroes. It just adds more variables to the mix, but that's part of what makes it fun, I think. Part of the joy is taking these questions and stretching them, continuing to ask, well, what if this, and what if that, and what would you think if this were the case? Again, it hardly ever presents any clear answers, but it's still, in my opinion, fun to think about. I know where my intuitions and stances generally lie in these areas, but to close this series, I'll leave you with a question that's been burning in X fandom for decades at this point and will likely forever remain relevant. Is Magneto right? Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode, and hopefully all 3 parts of it of Philosophy of X, and be sure to tune in next week as we dive into questions of identity with the ever-complicated Jean Grey. You can find me online at APBatman with 2 T's, and please be sure to subscribe here to The Aspect on YouTube and any platform where podcasts can be found. Please give us a like, leave a comment, and turn on that notification bell so that you never miss an episode. You can also follow us on Twitter/X, Instagram, and TikTok at The Aspect Co. Thank you again so much for listening, and I will see you next week.